Hello, my name is Max Banfield. Welcome to my talk. Today I'll be discussing addiction, and I'll deal with it in three ways. First, I'll discuss what addiction is. Secondly, I'll discuss the history of tobacco. And then I'll discuss some ways of preventing or treating the problem. Many years ago, I was offered scholarships to study leadership in a course called Group Work at the Institute of Technology. And to my surprise, all the subjects were about psychology. For instance, group work is group psychology. There's also psychology, and there's also sociology, for example, there's social psychology. Well, one of the subtopics was addiction. Now, there have been many theories on the cause of addiction. What I just do here is briefly discuss one of them. I'll use cigarettes as an example. If you smoke one cigarette a day, and it was like food, you'd keep on smoking one cigarette a day. But cigarettes contain nicotine, which is an addictive agent, and it produces a release of dopamine in the brain, and that gives a sense of well-being. But the problem with it is that if you've taken cigarettes every day for a while, what happens is it loses its effect. And so you soon start taking 2 cigarettes to get the same effect. It's not long before you're smoking a packet of cigarettes a day. So at that stage, if you stop taking cigarettes, and this produces symptoms that are the opposite of the beneficial symptoms that come from initially taking the first cigarette. And that is, you become anxious, you become depressed, you get angry, agitated, nervous, and so forth. And the only way to get back to that normal sense of well-being that you had before is to start smoking again. And so that's how you get into addiction, and how you get stuck in that situation. And that's what happens with cigarettes and other drugs. I'll now talk about the history of tobacco. Tobacco plant has probably been around since the dinosaurs, but it's apparent that was first known to be used from archaeological studies about 1,000 or 2,000 years ago in South America, where the natives there would get the tobacco leaf, roll it into river reeds, and then smoke it. And that gave them some beneficial effects. But it wasn't known to the Western world until Christopher Columbus and others sailed from their countries to travel west to find the other side of India. They came to America and thought it was India, and that's why they call the natives Indians. When they went to South America, they found Indian natives there who had a leaf, and that was tobacco, that they used as a painkiller and for other purposes. And the natives there would report that they were smoking, and the explorers would say, why don't you stop? And they say they couldn't. And that's an indication that they were addicted. So the people like Christopher Columbus and others took the tobacco and the plant back to Spain and England, and they started growing it, and doctors there used it as prescribed it as a medication. So, are you with me so far? That's how tobacco got to the Western world. Now, other people started smoking it, and it became popular. And so it became apparent then that a lot of money was to be made from it. And as the popularity increased, they invented a cigarette, the world's first cigarette rolling machine. So its popularity grew quite quickly. It was quite a long time before tobacco was known to cause cancer. So I'll briefly explain why that took so long. There are many diseases which people suffer from. They don't show an X-ray, so people say they're not there. You can't see them, so they say they're not there. Well, with tobacco, you start smoking when you're a teenager, and you don't get lung cancer until 30 odd years later. So people couldn't see the link between cause and effect. And when some people did, other people would deny it, say it wasn't possible, and they found it hard to believe that if it makes you feel good when you're a teenager, that it would kill you later. But then you get into the 19th century and cancer was called cirrhosis. And cancer of the lungs was cirrhosis of the lungs. But the link between cancer and cigarettes wasn't known until the 20th century. By then, the tobacco companies were making a fortune out of getting people to smoke cigarettes. And so they also knew that their target audience was teenagers. Because if you can get a teenager to smoke and you get them addicted, you've got them for 30 or 40 years before they get cancer. There's a lot of money to be made. There's not much point in getting an older person addicted because they're probably going to die anyway, sooner or later. But they're not going to be smoking for 30 or 40 years. So that's why teenagers were targeted by the tobacco companies. Get them addicted and you've got a customer for life. Now, in order to do that, they use role models. Teenagers are influenced by role models. So, for example, to get the Marlboro Man, a tough cowboy, smoking cigarettes while riding a horse in the fresh air. And teenagers aspired to be that type of man. And the other type they would do would be the Benson Hedges man, the sophisticated, wealthy, successful adult. So a lot of teenagers would aspire to be that type of person. So they'd follow the examples of the role models. But then they would also pay movie stars to smoke. And they'd pay movie companies even more money to put actors in their movies who smoked, to create this impression that it's widely used and that tough guys or intelligent people smoked. Other people who were approached were sporting champions, footballers, cricketers and American sporting team heroes would be encouraged to smoke. They'd be giving free packets of cigarettes. But in addition, you'd get them paying the football clubs. They'd offer them money if they'd advertise their products. And then you get that general approach. Then they start paying television and radio stations to advertise the products. One of the things they'd do would be get scientists to come in and say cigarette smoking is scientifically proven to be harmless, to counteract the scientists who said it would cause cancer. And they'd pay the scientists to run surveys and come to those false conclusions. They were acting as the merchants of doubt. There are plenty of indications that what those people were doing was going into radio studios or whatever with an envelope full of a couple of $1,000, slipping it across the bench and saying to the radio announcer that they've just discovered that cigarette smoking is actually harmless, despite what the other scientists say. And the radio announcers would say, isn't that wonderful? And teenagers got common sense. They should be allowed to smoke if they want. This is a free country. It's not Nazi Germany. Teenagers shouldn't be told not to smoke if they want to smoke. So this went on through the media. Then they'd start, of course, paying newspaper owners and television station owners a lot of money to saturate the TVs with advertising for cigarettes. Well, earlier in the 20th century, there was an attempt to broaden the number of smokers. So they tried to get children ready. So they manufactured lollies that look like small cigarettes. The idea was this: children get used to smoking, or just used to the lollies, and when they became teenagers, they'd be big boys and they'd smoke. When they're teenagers, they'd be tough men when they got older. So this role model situation was part of the program. But then the tobacco companies realised they're only getting half the population, men. So they targeted women. And this was earlier in the 20th century. So that's what was happening. Now, the problem was the evidence that cigarettes caused cancer was increasing. And so was the evidence that it was addictive, scientific evidence. So there's another problem, and that is this. Teenagers were watching their fathers die of cancer because 30 years had gone by, their kids were growing up, their fathers were dying of cancer. So from now on, really, the tobacco industry was going to go downhill because the idea that it was safe was no longer believable. Too many people knew, too many people were dying. And it's also becoming too expensive for the government to ignore because the cost of chemotherapy, etc. So then there were attempts to stop cigarette smoking. But then the tobacco industry would start, if a politician said he's going to ban cigarettes, the tobacco countries would bribe his opposition to say, to pay him election campaign funds so that he could get better advertising for his election, so that he could defeat anyone who wanted to stop smoking. And then the tobacco companies paid a lot of money to political parties. So if one political party said they're going to ban smoking, the tobacco companies would put a lot of money into the opposition to get them to, so that they could win and then that law wouldn't be passed. I hope you're still with me so far. So there's a lot of pressure on politicians, a lot of pressure on the media to keep cigarettes going, even though it was scientifically proven that it was addictive and causing cancer. And the tobacco companies had plenty of money to do that. Well, eventually, in the 1960s and 70s, it was a downhill run for the tobacco company. Too many people knew it was cancer, and politicians who voted to keep tobacco companies be voted out, and those who banned it would be voted in. And that's when the tobacco company went into its demise. And what happened then was they banned cigarette advertising. So signs on roads that were 50 feet high disappeared. Advertising at football grounds all around the fences was banned. Sporting heroes would stop smoking. TVs weren't allowed to have, movie companies weren't allowed to have smokers in their movies, etc. There were all sorts of laws aimed at eliminating or reducing tobacco advertising. In addition to that, the packets of cigarettes couldn't contain sort of hero-worshipping role models. It had to contain black lungs from cancer, deformed faces and lips from throat and mouth cancer, etc. And that was aimed at telling people who smoke, this is the truth. You do have a right to smoke, but don't be kidding yourself. It will cause cancer. In other words, the correct facts were put on the cigarette packets. Now the other thing is, and the final thing is this, when that they put the cigarettes into shops, they're still available, because people do have a right to do anything. If they know it's going to kill themselves and they want to take the chance, that's their right. But if they ban cigarettes, criminals would start selling them. And the government can't control criminals or tax them. But while there's some available in shops, they can control the shop distribution and they can tax them. So that's what's happened. You can still go to a shop, and buy cigarettes. So what are you going to do about this situation? Well, I'll give you two examples. The first is what happened in my case. When I was 12, I'd already had a dozen illnesses. None of them were my fault. And I'd survived. So I had this attitude that if I'm going to get sick in the future, I might not be able to stop it, but I'm not going to make myself sick. So one day, my father had been told that the way to stop your kid from getting addicted to cigarettes was not to let him go to school where kids will tell him it's great, but to teach him yourself. Give him a cigarette and watch him go green at the gills and get sick, and then tell him, don't smoke or you'll always be sick. Well, my father tried that with me, and he rolled a cigarette. He rolled his own cigarettes and gave me one. I took 2 puffs on it and didn't inhale and handed it back to him. Now, I can tell you I have never had the slightest inclination to smoke cigarettes. I've found other ways of getting through life without having to reach for a cigarette every time I want one. It's so easy. I've never had even the slightest addiction to it or the slightest desire to smoke. You can do the same. You can tell your kids to do the same. The other thing is this. You can go and buy yourself a kayak. You can go down to the beach where there are white beach sands, palm trees, clean blue seas, clean blue skies, paddle about and inhale the fresh air and live happily ever after without